You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by NICOLA SPURLING on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.
Hello, this is the Social Justice Podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by Dee McWatters, Vice President of Advocacy Canada. Thank you for joining the podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Dee McWatters. Pronouns are she, her, and I reside on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territory of the Syilx people in the Okanagan. Happy to talk about all things from my transition through to equity, diversity, inclusion, and in sport, and social justice within that.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. I've been looking forward to it since we met up last summer and we started talking about the possibility of having you on the podcast. So I'm glad it's finally happening. And
Yes, me too.
yeah, and to start with, what is Advocacy Canada as an organization, and how did you end up becoming involved in that?
Advocacy Canada is relatively new. I guess I think we're actually going to our fourth year.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of the brainchild of Wilbur Turner, who is the founder and president of Advocacy Canada. And he started the organization, which is a 2S LGBTQIA plus advocacy organization. We don't put on a lot of events and parties and whatnot. It is more on an advocacy aspect. But he started it actually for advocating for seniors from the queer community, especially seniors that were kind of going into kind of later stages of life, going into care,
Okay.
where in many cases that these seniors were going back in the closet just to feel safe, because those that cared for them maybe weren't accepting, or even the other residents were accepting. So that's how it got its roots. I got involved. I was involved with Kelowna Pride Society, and we were at a kind of a crossroads. This is about 2 years ago now. Of with its growth, was Kelowna Pride more about organizing the Pride festivities every year, or was there more community advocacy work? As you can imagine, the Kelowna Pride Festival is quite a large undertaking. And it was more about that aspect and less about the community advocacy work. And that didn't quite align with my values. I wanted to do more community advocacy work. And as I resigned from my role with Kelowna Pride, um, Wilbur actually reached out to me and we had coffee and a conversation about Advocacy Canada and what it could be. And so that's actually how I started getting involved. So I have now been with Advocacy Canada for just shy of 2 years. And I've been elected twice now as the vice president of Advocacy Canada.
Wow. I didn't realize that those were that was the background of the organization, because we've worked together on a committee related to inclusion in sports, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But I want to touch on that seniors piece, because that wasn't something I was originally going to ask you about. But that's a huge epidemic among queer folks. As you age, you lose that sense of community. You move into care homes. Maybe people aren't as accepting. Maybe your peers around you aren't as accepting. And so I have heard that people are going back into the closet in those situations. Is that something that the organization is still very heavily involved in?
Yes, and that's primarily, I can't speak too much of it. That's really more kind of Wilbur's corner, I would say. Like, we all bring different strengths to the organization as the board of directors. And the inclusion in sport, that's one of the things that I always kind of wanted to bring to it when I got involved, is my background in sport, my love of sport, and just that inclusion. So that was kind of my piece. So when we started this talking about it in the fall, that's when I got really excited, because this is really, my arena, so to speak.
Right. Well, and speaking of your arena, you have this huge passion for EDI work. I'm curious to know what inspires that passion in you.
It really had an evolution of its own. Um, I would say, because through my transition and coming out, I came out publicly just over 7 years ago, and even to myself, just less than 8 years ago. Um, Being transgender wasn't something I really understood within myself. I'm Gen X, so didn't really kind of grow up with the terminology, just knew that something in my mind was a little different. So when I came out, there was definitely nothing secretive about it. There wasn't pulling off too many layers at once, or sorry, at certain different times. It was basically like taking off my winter clothes and my woolies and being right down to my long johns all at once because,
Mhm.
well, that's just how it was going to be. But one of the things I was heavily involved in was within hockey. My boys were still playing hockey, so I was coaching them at the U18 level. I was very involved in officiating, and I wanted to continue that. And I did continue that. And even as my hair grew longer, I pierced my ears, I had earrings. Although you wouldn't tell today because I have been dropping too many pucks lately. My nails are a little rough, but I with a great intent, I'm out there officiating on the ice, um, with visibility. So that visibility wasn't being intentional. Um, I wanted to create space that whether players or other participants within the game knew it or not, I wanted to say, this is a safe space. I'm comfortable here.
Right.
And that led to being selected for the first ever BC Hockey Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Work Group that was formed just over 2 years ago. And I was being appointed to that committee. And starting into that committee, starting to discuss and recommend changes on how we can start being more diverse, being more inclusive in a large sporting organization, I realized we were just scratching the surface and that sure, there was my background as a queer and trans person coming from the sport, but I realized there was so much more to the aspect of EDI I needed to learn. And I started within the UBC Certificate of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion um, education program. And just before Christmas this year, I got my certificate and graduated.
Wow,
And
congratulations on that.
yeah, so it's just knowing I needed to learn more. I wanted to learn more. I yearned for that knowledge because that knowledge is the power, is the capability to help more. And that's kind of how it all just kind of evolved into a huge passion. And, it's not just, it's not work because it is more than a hobby. It is my passion and I live it and I breathe it and it's every day.
Right. And it's sort of an interesting time to have a passion for EDI work or DEI, as it's often referred to in the States. And DEI seems to be kind of a dirty word these days, at least in the minds of conservatives, right? So I'm curious to know what you think prompted this switch in attitude around EDI or DEI, and how we push back against this idea that DEI is somehow the opposite of meritocracy.
Yes, and I'm also intentional about saying EDI. Often we add other letters to DEIA, accessibility,
Hmm.
and the J or JEDI, which stands for social justice, rather than the DEI as we hear from the States, because of the connotation. Now, I think the pushback, what I've experienced, and I haven't experienced so much the pushback. I just want to state that. But what we're seeing in the South is the lack of education of what it actually is. For even here within my own region, within Canada, that I'm having to explain constantly what EDI stands for. And yes, the sense of what is meritocracy versus what they say DEI or DEI hires. And it's not about filling a quota. It's not about, hiring someone so that the balancing of the numbers of race or gender or orientation or somebody with a disability. It is, it's like we're in a race and the straight white males started at the 50-yard line and only have to get to the 100,
Hmm.
while so many other people are much further behind. And when I explain what EDI truly is and what it comes down to, just valuing people start to have a different take and like, oh, that really actually makes sense. And it's about approaching how do we know we're getting the best candidates coming to the table to even apply for a position, whether a nonprofit or whether it's a sporting organization or a business.
Hmm.
It's about bringing the best people to the table, but we might be excluding the best people by just not even looking at the lens of inclusion.
Right.
So it's long-winded as far as explaining it sometimes to people, but then you start to see that glimmer of light and they're like, okay, I'm starting to get this.
Right. And you talked about working on EDI initiatives within hockey specifically, and I know that you're involved in sports more broadly than just that. I'm curious to know how you ended up going down that path. Was it just through officiating and making connections that way? Was there a concerted effort that you had in terms of reaching out to these organizations and saying, I really think that you need to do some more work when it comes to this? Or how did that all come to be?
Um, like I say, just officiating, just being me, being open. I guess about 3 years ago, I was involved in the U15, so under 15 female provincial championships in Kelowna, BC. I only had a couple of games, but there were some people from BC Hockey that wanted to do a story for Pride Week coming up with BC Hockey. So being part of those championships connected me with a few people at BC Hockey, and then they did a story. We found out that for just before it came out with BC Hockey, they actually got picked up. They wanted the story to go all with Hockey Canada.
Hmm.
So that actually was pretty cool. So Pride Week in 2022, my story of officiating coming out was picked up and was a feature story for Hockey Canada for the month of June.
Wow.
That led me to connecting with people within Hockey Canada. And there was a lot of change, and that's when a lot of the negative issues with the junior team of the day came out. So there was a lot of upheaval and change of board of directors. But in that time, I was able to connect with people at Hockey Canada and was involved in a number of conversations just about change and what would that look like. And everyone was just kind of throwing things in the air. What do we need to do? And one of those new changes was in the fall of 2022. Hockey Canada hired a manager of gender diversity and expression.
Hmm.
And he reached out to me and we had some conversations. And I actually had some input in Hockey Canada's gender diversity policy. So that was pretty cool to have some input in that. And then BC Hockey put out that they wanted to start an EDI committee or work group and put out applications or call to applications for people to be involved. And from the numerous applications that they had, they said it was the largest response of any kind of role within BC Hockey they'd ever had. And January of 2023, we were all notified, and it started with a committee of about 6 of us, which quickly dropped, unfortunately, by one, as one of the committee members went on mat leave.
Hmm.
But it left us with the opportunity for those that were there kind of to meet, to discuss. And that's really when we kind of scratched the surface. And that's where I really started to get the passion of wanting to get involved more and more and more. And as I got into those spaces, I just started being louder and, an experience of why things need to change. And that's because understanding my past privilege of in the past, I did identify as a white, straight, cisgender male. And in those spaces of hockey. So I understood, as that changed to being a trans gay woman, that, losing some of that privilege, but understanding where I came from and certain people holding that privilege and not realizing and seeing that the game is in decline in enrollment in certain areas. And by embracing equity, diversity, inclusion, and embracing that inclusion of people newer to the game, that's actually where the growth and sustainability of the game is going to come from.
Hmm.
So, unless you want the game to die, you actually have to embrace an aspect of EDI.
Right. And it's so important for those big sort of governing bodies or big teams that are, everyone sees them. It's really important that they are the ones who are particularly involved in EDI work and in changing the narrative and shaping people's minds around these subjects. And I know that through the work that I do on the Pride Advisory Committee for the Vancouver Whitecaps, where that commitment to EDI trickles down into soccer throughout the Lower Mainland because of this one organization that really took the initiative to make something happen there. And that is sort of happening to some degree within basketball as well. So I was wondering if you could tell us about Harriet McKenzie, some of the issues that she's faced, and what Advocacy Canada is doing to help her.
Yeah, it's what an amazing story of courage and resilience. And the article, it's a long article, but a fantastic article just came out in the Toronto Star. So we were connected with Harriet and her family through Senator Christopher Wells in the fall, as say this family, is seeking some help, some support. And Harriet's had quite a journey throughout her life, identifying as transgender, yet never, ever, ever having identified as male. She knew pretty much as soon as she could walk. And she is just an amazing basketball player. And it's her passion, it's her sport. Both of her parents played collegiate basketball. It's in her blood. Not going too much into her story of so much of the past, I guess, say, if you have a link to the Toronto Star article, that really brings up a lot. But where we get involved comes in last year when she plays with the Vancouver Island University, and their team's called the Mariners, and they were playing Columbia Bible College.
Mm.
And I believe in the Friday game, because they'll do a Friday and a Saturday game, that there was some kind of a little bit rougher play, we'll say. And then there was some calling out by the coach of Columbia Bible College to Harriet's coach, and these were very transphobic remarks. Ones that we hear the rhetoric in sport. It's a man playing in a women's sport. How can you allow this to happen? Again, these are people that do not recognize trans women as women, and that's just calling it what that is. The next game on the Saturday, Harriet was quite viciously fouled. It had nothing to do with the basketball play, and it's definitely on video. You can see it was just a vicious attack. And Columbia Bible College coach can be seen doing what we call the slow clap, which she defended as just applauding her players' play, but we know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
That prompted Harriet to kind of come out again and just make a call to action on that. And her team just supported her so immensely. And that's when we were connected to the family through Christopher Wells. And that's really what we prompted why we wanted to do an inclusion in sport. The reason this was a big deal is that not only did they not feel physically safe playing against Columbia Bible College, but they were to play Columbia Bible College in January at their college. So they physically feel safe, but also emotionally safe. And that's a big part. Columbia Bible College was also to be hosting the provincials this past end of the season. And the call went out to Pac West, which is their conference, to make that change because there was this issue. And long story short, actually, after a couple of months of investigation by Pac West, they actually suspended Columbia Bible College's coach, and they did get the provincials moved, which was big. And Vancouver Island University did win the provincials and went to the national championships. I went to Nanaimo to meet the family because I wanted to meet them. I wanted to see Harriet play. And I actually spoke with someone in the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion department at Vancouver Island University, and it it was nice meeting them and having a discussion, but also meeting Harriet and her family was just amazing.
Mhm.
Uh, I really connected with her brother because he actually plays hockey and he's a goalie.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, Harriet's just amazing. Her family's amazing, and just everything that she's gone through. You know what? She's my hero.
Mhm.
A lot of people say, Dee, your voice and your visibility, but I tell you, Harriet's my hero. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, Harriet's a
and
pretty incredible
great
person.
story. Yeah,
Mhm.
say
Uh,
I've been getting all teary.
yeah, well, no, I really appreciate you talking about that story. I know of Harriet through the work that we're doing on this committee for inclusion in sports, but I don't know that I've ever heard that full story, and I'm really curious now to check out that article
Yeah.
in the Toronto Star.
The article it's very extensive. It's a fantastic read, and there's so much backstory of her growing up. Like it's their story to tell. I just have some snippets that resonate with me, but when you read the article, there's so much. Um, have tissues nearby because it's a tearjerker.
Mhm.
But also where she goes from here could be, I think she's breaking that glass ceiling. So it's fantastic.
Right. Well, and you talk about the school that created all of these issues being a religious school.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how much do you think religion influences people's perception of trans folks? Because I know it's often used as a weapon. It's often bastardized in some way in order to make people feel as though their preconceived hateful ideas are somehow backed by their theology. What do you think that the role of religion in hatred towards trans people is?
And that's interesting because I want to share just a personal anecdote. Um, I've never really been that religious. Um, I was baptized, and I have a faith of something of a higher power. Perhaps I believe in God. And just recently, I've been kind of seeking some spirituality. Um, the one church I have some kind of connection to with my past is the United Church of Canada.
Hmm.
And it is extremely inclusive. And I just went to my first ever church service a week ago,
Huh.
and it was their affirming service. Our minister has a trans daughter. The musical lead, she's gay. The people were so inclusive, and it is such an inclusive feeling. So if your religion is not inclusive, find one that is.
Hmm.
And I'm not an atheist. I believe in something. I felt very welcome by everybody that was in that space. And it's one thing to say you're welcoming, but when you feel welcome,
Hmm.
that's the full piece. So, yes, there are aspects of religion that are very anti-trans or anti-queer, and those that kind of fall out, you're reading the wrong parts. You're picking and choosing the wrong parts.
Right.
I choose kindness, and everybody that has been around me in the last 2 services that I've gone to, it's been very inclusive, very welcoming, and the people around me, all they preach is just kindness to all,
Hmm.
and I believe in my deep down that is the truth of what a religion perhaps could be or should be, and
Right.
it just allowed me some spirituality to connect with who I am.
Well, and that's important to note that not all religion has to look hateful. In fact, a lot of it doesn't look that way, right? And there's a great skit from The West Wing where the president at that time, or the fictional president, I suppose, gave this incredible speech about how people are picking and choosing pieces of the Bible in order to, I guess, oppress gay people. That we're talking trans people at the moment, but at the time that was the big thing, right? Is a man shall not lie with another man, and Sure. I mean, you can interpret the Bible in that way, but there's so many other aspects of the Bible that we don't pay attention to because they're outdated or they're not relevant to our lives. Why is it that one piece that people are pulling from and saying this is what we're going to use in order to go after this group of people? And like you said, I think it's that picking and choosing piece of saying, well, this is an idea that I hold that gay people are bad, and oh, hey, look, I found a book that kind of supports that, and I'm going to then just point to that and ignore the rest of the book. Um, but I want to shift into a personal experience that I've had recently because I think it relates to that conversation that we were just having about Harriet Mackenzie. So I was supposed to be playing at a soccer tournament this month. They have recently made a decision to exclude trans and non-binary people in the name of fairness. So in essence, what they've said is that people who are assigned male at birth have to play with men. People who are assigned female at birth have to play with women. This is not a policy as of yet. And it's not a stance that they've taken in previous years because I've played in this tournament for a number of years prior to this. But it's because of this current political climate that we live in, they've decided they needed to make a decision. And it's unusual to me that they would call this fair. And I'm curious to know your thoughts. Do you believe that this is a fair way to approach it? I mean, I'm guessing I know the answer to this one. And how do you think organizations would actually try to enforce something like this? Because if you're saying we're going to base who joins which group based on your gender assigned at birth, but your gender assigned at birth isn't listed on any documentation, how exactly do you expect to enforce something like that, or how might they go about trying to do that?
Yeah, that's a like I say, that's a great question. And it's one that, I'm hit with all the time. Um, and that the assigned at birth, it's that, we have the ability to have our documentation align with us.
Mhm.
And my birth certificate says female and my ID says female. So there's nothing actually currently out there anywhere that says, assigned male at birth. So, I mean, that's one thing. And the other aspect of, those of us that have, gone through HRT or, whatever other aspects of transitioning that we choose to be. And as I say, our choice, our transition, everything like that. I know personally that how much strength I lost within the first 3 to 6 months of losing testosterone and, starting with the estrogen that it's like, wow, it's unbelievable how much hormones plays a role in our development and all aspects of our development. Policy, why do we fight it or why do we not fight it? I think all of these could be won in a court.
Mhm.
The toughest part is, what's your time? What's, is every person going to do a legal case against an organization that has lawyers to back them? Or you could say a tournament might be a month away. Um, that's all things that, so they're hiding behind a policy or non-policy just because they feel it. What I say is I bring up so many different pieces of information, research that I've gone looking for, which a whole ton of it is compiled into the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, the CCES, the executive report on transgender in sport, which talks about so many other um, reports that just shows how with trans women that there is no competitive advantage. You know, with talking about HRT in particular in that 12 to 24 month kind of range, that certainly after 24 months, there is nothing and so many aspects. And it's people just ignoring science. I mean,
Mm.
it's scientific evidence, it's facts. I argued, with one person, they're like, well, but those reports aren't scientific evidence enough. And it's like, well, yes, because if you understand a scientific experiment, you have to be able to repeat it so many times and so many times, and anybody else can repeat it. And you have to have a large enough subject matter. Well, we know there's not a lot of us to begin with.
Mhm.
So in some cases, there aren't enough transgender athletes to make the study big enough. But where those studies are, it's overwhelming and irrefutable evidence that trans women do not have that advantage. And again, we're talking about trans women only. Why are we not talking about trans men?
Mm-hmm.
And that comes in what we call the trans misogyny, which is just misogyny. Men don't really care about the women in sport. When I talk about women in sport and people defend fairness of women and girls sports, surprisingly, it is almost exclusively cisgender men that are opposed.
Mm-hmm. And that's what
My
this
biggest
tournament
allies,
organizes.
my biggest allies are cisgender women.
Yeah.
The women on my hockey team are my biggest allies, and they know it. And maybe that's because women just understand the trials and tribulations of women against men in sport and the misogyny that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ridiculous, but I'll keep fighting. I'll keep fighting. I'll keep being in those spaces. And like I say, when you talk about, well, if they're assigned female at birth, it's like, I'll show you some really, really strong, men that were assigned female at birth. And I would not feel fair playing against them because they're men.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And I'm sure you feel the same.
yeah. Well, what boggles my mind about this every time too is that, sure, I get the conversation around fairness, but at the same time, I only really understand it when it comes to very high level sports where minute differences in performance are going to be really highlighted because everyone's competing at the highest level possible. When you're talking about recreational sports, there's such a huge range of ability levels. And whether or not someone has a minute advantage over someone else because of some sort of physical characteristic that they have is kind of irrelevant. And I don't understand this desire that organizers of leagues or events have, in that it's going to make their lives absolutely miserable because they're going to face backlash and they're going to have to potentially defend themselves against, lawsuits, human rights complaints, whatever it might be, all because of what, right? Like it's
Yeah.
kind of a non-issue, or it is a non-issue. And when coming back to this tournament in specific, keep in mind that trans and non-binary people at the time that they made this decision had already registered and booked non-refundable accommodations. And their ability to then participate is being removed at a date where it's too late to really, not suffer damages, as it were. So I'm wondering, in an instance like this, you talked about how there could be potential for legal challenges and things like this, but is there also maybe an avenue where people could file a human rights complaint and say this is discrimination on the basis of gender identity?
Yes. I mean, if we're discussing here in British Columbia or here in Canada, absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, that's written into our constitution.
Right.
So, that's there, plain and simple. Um, and that's certainly something that with our inclusion in sport, to segue into that, is what we actually want to work on is developing policy that can be put into legislation so that discrimination cannot happen. That
Mhm.
inclusion in sport is in fact what that is, inclusion for however that may look for us. It's interesting talking about some of the elite levels. There's a couple little anecdotes. Obviously, the Leah Thomas story in the NCAA
Mhm.
championships, and we talk about diversity in all kinds of people. And I did a little bit of research and studying, what is the average height of the competitive swimmer? And the high level competitive swimmer, elite level, NCAA, Olympic level, men are 3 to 4 inches taller than non-competitive athletic men in society.
Mhm.
And then women, believe it or not, are also 3 to 4 inches taller than the average.
Mhm.
So the average male swimmer at a high competitive level is 6'3". The average female swimmer at that elite high level competitiveness is 6'1".
Hmm.
Leah Thomas is 6'1".
Okay.
The most decorated swimmer ever in Canada, Penny Alexiak. Guess how tall she is?
I'm guessing taller than that.
No,
Or
but she's
similar.
6'1". She's
6'1".
6'1".
Yeah.
So, yeah, most swimmers are not that tall. So that's the competitive advantage, and that's the variety, diversity that exists within humanity. And
Mhm.
it depends on the sport. In masters cycling, Dr. Veronica Ivy, who won a world's masters cycling championships in the velodrome, as a trans woman, the person that came in second really kicked up a big stink about it. But nowhere in there did she ever say that she actually beat Dr. Ivy the previous 14 races. The
Wow.
one time Veronica beat the other person, they cried foul.
Right.
Fortunately, the World Cycling Union came up with these open female and male. So Dr. Ivy could cycle in the open class. And as she said, who am I going to cycle against? She's the only transgender person in masters cycling in the world.
Mhm.
So it's redundant. There's nobody to cycle against. She can cycle in men's, where she has and cannot hold a candle to men's cyclists, and they ban her from competing in women's. So where's the fairness there?
Right.
When we're
Exactly.
talking about banning people, and there's bans like in the NCAA, 530,000 athletes. The head of athletics for the NCAA said he's aware of only 10 transgender athletes.
Mhm.
Women in those sports that are like the Riley Gaines, like President Trump, are going up and saying, banning certain people that don't even exist in the sports that they're talking about. So it just becomes ridiculous. We go round and round in circles. It's like, who is this hurting?
Mhm. Yeah, well, and you talked about the possibility for policy or legislation to be implemented that would protect inclusion in sports and make sure that it's explicit that that applies to gender diverse folks. And I'm wondering why we would need to go that route if we already have gender identity and gender expression protected by the Canadian Human Rights Act and the BC Human Rights Code. Is there something missing there that is being used to discriminate against trans and non-binary folks?
Yes. And that's in Alberta.
I see. Okay, so it's
Where
different provinces.
exactly. And there was the attempt by John Rustad and the Conservatives last spring with the Women and Girls Safe Sport bill that he introduced, which was very quickly knocked down. And I read it, and it is everything they talk about is basically just not accepting trans women as women. Pardon my French, it's just garbage. And really what they brought into legislation into Alberta is not based on any facts. The sports bans and the healthcare bans, there's zero science behind what they did. And unfortunately, there's nothing if everybody that wants it, that ban, to vote for it, to stop them. And it's
Mhm.
just 100% opinion. So let's get out there ahead of it and call it for what it is. And being discrimination, let's put in policy that we're researching the science, state the science behind things, because it's irrefutable.
Mhm.
And I may be a little bit older, but certainly still as a trans woman, I know how much harder it is to lose the pounds. You have to train so much harder. It it's it sucks not being able to do what I used to do, and that's not just age. That's because I'm a woman,
Mhm.
and and yeah, it's a hard one to accept.
Right. Well, and you talk about how we have to mobilize and make these types of political changes, and we have an election coming up in Canada soon. So how are you and how is Advocacy Canada going to be attempting to ensure that we have a government that's supportive of 2S LGBTQIA plus rights?
Well, first off, we have to be nonpartisan. We aren't quite there yet, but we're very close to getting charitable status. And
Mm,
one of the things within that is being nonpartisan,
very
but
strict about that. Hmm.
very strict about that. But with that said, the most important thing is just to encourage people to get out to vote, to research and ask the tough questions to their candidates. Don't just go to social media. There's too much artificial intelligence feeding us the negative. Say, do the research, ask the tough questions, go to the candidates. But the biggest thing is that there's still such a huge, huge silent majority of allies. And this is the call to our allies, to our friends, to our families is stop being quiet, stop being complacent. You know what you believe in. You know what is right. This is our call to action for you to please start being our voice so that we're not always the ones being the voice, being the visibility. You know, my friend Amber, who is on Advocacy Canada, and she is one of our allies. She identifies as a straight cisgender female, and she's our communications director. But she's such an amazing ally, and she's vocal with that allyship. And as she says, it's allyship is not um, it's not a noun. It's not who you are. It's what you do. It's a verb,
Hmm.
and she exemplifies this. And that's what I my call to all of my friends and family is start being vocal. When you hear something that's garbage, call out the shit. When you if it looks like shit, smells like shit, it's shit. So you know what? If it stinks, yeah,
Yeah,
you know something's wrong there.
call that out.
And like I say, you know it's a call to action to our allies,
Hmm.
and they know it's right. We know it's right.
Right. Well, we've talked a lot about trans inclusion in sports, and we've touched on obviously the work that Advocacy Canada does, and a few other things. Is there anything that we haven't touched on at this point that you think would be really important to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think if not only just in sport, um, but I mean, if you were involved in a sport and you see something where, you know, there isn't the advocating for inclusion and equity, ask why there isn't. You know, I think one of the leading organizations has been Soccer Canada, and Hockey Canada is getting there, but it's a long road, and everyone's, you know, it's they're waiting for the top down. But if you're within an organization and you're waiting for the umbrella organization, why wait? You know
Hmm.
what? You can activate locally, provincially. Why not move it up? Why not, if you see something, ask the questions. Why are we not there yet? And you know what? Get active. If you don't want to get active, then call me and I'll get active.
Fantastic. And from your perspective, this is a question I ask in all of these episodes. What is your hope for the future? That could be related to trans inclusion in sports. It could be broader than that. Just what are you when you think of the ideal future? What are you thinking of?
One that there is one still.
Well, I hope
um,
we can still get somewhere, at least better.
yeah. You know what? That it just doesn't matter who you are, what you do, who you love. Um, and I'm starting to see that in the next generation. My kids are 21 and geez, the oldest one's almost 24. And they're my heroes. They were 14 and 16 when I came out, and they weren't phased a bit. And you know, we still love the same things. We still love hockey. We still fight about which is the best team, but they get it. And we need to listen to them a lot more. And I see whether it's in my lifetime or not, it just whether it's sport or just in society that it just doesn't matter. You know,
Hmm.
just be authentic, be who you are, love who you are, When I came out, I told myself I was never going to lie to myself ever again. I was never going to lie to another person. And I'm 7.5 years living that and being active, not lying. And I could say living my best life, ups and downs.
Mm.
I'm living my most authentic life. And living my most authentic life means I'm living my happiest life. And it's amazing finding that. And when you do, and you know, you just follow that, it's amazing what doors do open.
Right. And in terms of opening those doors and making sure that we live in a world eventually where it doesn't matter and everyone can hopefully feel supported and feel a sense of belonging. What are some steps, and you've touched on a few already, that our audience can do to help get us there?
Allyship, educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself, and encourage others to educate themselves. And the reason I say that is not so much educate others, because sometimes people need to find it within themselves first to really get that aha moment. So educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself. And that is contagious.
Hmm.
And within that, be kind to yourself. Remember your own mental health. Mental health and physical health are hand in hand. I always have to remember about my mental health too, because if we don't take care of that, then physical health doesn't matter because we're not really here to help anybody.
Hmm.
Be kind to yourself, listen to yourself, and be kind to everybody else.
Fantastic advice. And thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Nicola. It's been fantastic.
Of course, yeah. No, I love chatting with you. I'm looking forward to our next meeting. And yeah, thank
Yes.
you again.
Yeah.
This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. Today I've been joined by Dee McWatters, the Vice President of Advocacy Canada, for a conversation about queer rights and inclusion in sports and what we can all do to make the world a better place. And thank you again.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by NICOLA SPURLING on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.